I was looking at a family photo album the other day. You know, one of those really old physical ones with the peeling plastic sheets.
Oh, yeah, I know the ones.
And I found myself playing that classic game. Oh, he has grandpa's nose, or she definitely got the recessive blue eyes from that side of the family.
Hmm.
We're just so conditioned to think about genetics as this, like, very visible inventory of parts.
The Mendel legacy, right? Wrinkled peas, smooth peas.
It is the Mendel legacy. And, to be fair, it's a good starting point. That's how the field was born. We call those morphological markers.
Morphological
Yeah,
marker.
you're tracking the phenotype, the physical expression to figure out what's going on underneath. But if you stop there, which I mean is where most high school biology classes stop,
Right.
you are looking at a very low resolution map.
Low resolution is putting it mildly.
Yeah?
It feels like trying to navigate a city using a map that only shows, I don't know, the skyscrapers.
That's a perfect analogy. You can see the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, but you have no idea where the streets are or the subway stations or, the coffee shops.
That is a spot-on analogy. And for a long time, geneticists were basically stuck navigating by those skyscrapers. We used those visible traits to map genomes, but we ran into a massive problem.
Which was?
We just ran out of landmarks.
Yeah.
Complex organisms like us, or even the crops we eat, they don't have enough of those visible single-gene traits to create a really detailed map. You can't just wait for a wrinkled pea to show up every time you need to find a gene.
So the shift we're talking about today, this move to molecular markers, is essentially about filling in those street names. We're abandoning the mirror and looking directly at the chemical blueprint.
We are looking at the landscape of the DNA itself.
Yeah.
And the source material we're diving into today makes a really crucial distinction. These new markers, these molecular landmarks, they usually have absolutely nothing to do with your nose shape or eye color.
Right.
In fact, a lot of the time they don't do anything at all.
This is the part that always trips people up. We're mapping the genome using the quote-unquote junk DNA.
The non-coding regions, yes. I try to avoid the word junk because we're finding out more and more that those regions have really important regulatory functions, but
Yeah.
for the purpose of mapping,
Yeah.
they're just raw data. They're stretches of code that vary between people. And because they vary, we can use them as signposts.
So the sources for this deep dive focus on a few different types of these signposts. We've got the modern heavy hitters like SMPs and STRs, but the bulk of the technical breakdown is on RFLP.
RFLP, restriction fragment length polymorphism.
Rolls right off the tongue.
It's a mouthful, I know. But we have to start there. Even though we have faster, cheaper methods now, RFLP is really the grandfather of DNA profiling.
Okay.
If you want to understand how we actually see a difference in DNA without sequencing the whole thing, RFLP is the best teacher. It was the technology that cracked cases like the Colin Pitchfork murder inquiry in the UK, the first time DNA was ever used to catch a killer.
Wow. Okay. I definitely want to get into the mechanics of that, but let's just briefly set the scene with the other options. The notes mention SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. That's what the big commercial companies use, right? 23andMe and so on.
Primarily, yes. A SNP is just a single letter change. I might have a T in a specific spot. You have an A. They're incredibly common. We're talking millions of them in a single genome.
Millions.
And because they're so abundant, they're the gold standard now for high throughput scanning. If you're trying to find a gene linked to something complex like heart disease risk or quantitative traits in crops, you use SNPs. You can just sprinkle millions of them over the map.
Okay, and then there are STRs, short tandem repeats.
Which is the current standard for forensics.
Yeah.
The FBI's CODIS database is all based on these. It's just like a stutter in the DNA.
Kakaka. So it's not the letters that are different, it's how many times they repeat.
Exactly. Maybe I have 12 repeats and you have 15. It's highly variable between people, which makes it absolutely perfect for identification.
But both of those technologies, SNPs and STRs, they rely heavily on PCR, which is basically a way to photocopy DNA.
Right.
The source material today takes us back to a method that's a bit more, visceral. RFLP doesn't just photocopy, it needs scissors.
Molecular scissors. This is where we really get into the elegance of the chemistry. To understand RFLP, you have to understand restriction enzymes.
These are proteins that were first found in bacteria, right, as a defense mechanism.
Originally, yes.
Yeah.
Bacteria use them to chop up invading viral DNA, but we've co-opted them. And these enzymes are incredibly picky. They don't just cut DNA anywhere. They're looking for a specific password, a specific sequence of bases.
The example in our notes is E. coli.
A classic. E. coli scans the DNA strand looking for one very specific sequence.
Yeah.
GAATC. It reads that sequence, it binds to it, and snip. It cuts the backbone of the DNA right there.
And this isn't a rare thing. I mean, the math in the source material suggests the sequence pops up quite a bit.
It's a probability game. DNA has 4 bases. A, C, T, G. If the arrangement is random, the odds of finding that specific 6-letter combo GATTC is 4 to the power of 6.
Which is 4,096.
Right. So roughly every 4,000 letters,
Yeah.
you expect a cut, give or take. Now, apply that to a human genome with 3 billion base pairs. If you dump E. coli into a test tube with human DNA, you don't get 2 halves.
No, you get millions of fragments. You're shredding the genome into a pile of confetti.
Exactly. A pile of confetti.
And this is where the polymorphism comes in, the P in RFLP, because my confetti pile and your confetti pile won't look exactly the same.
Precisely. And this is the absolute key concept. Let's say there's a specific spot on chromosome 4 where most people have that GATC sequence. The enzyme cuts there.
Yeah.
But maybe you have a mutation, a single letter change. So your sequence is GACTC.
A typo in the password.
And the enzyme is completely literal, doesn't recognize the typo, so it just skips that spot and keeps on scanning.
So where everyone else's DNA gets cut into 2 smaller pieces, mine stays as 1 long piece.
And that difference in length, the fragment length, that is the polymorphism.
But, okay, here's the problem I always have with this mental image. We have a test tube. It's full of millions of these DNA scraps. How do we actually find that one specific difference on chromosome 4? It's not like you can just look at the tube and say, oh, look, that piece is longer.
No, you can't. It's all just clear liquid to the naked eye.
Yeah.
We have to sort it, and then we have to light it up. Step 1 is the sorting. Gel electrophoresis.
The electric sieve.
That's a good way to put it. You load that DNA confetti into a slab of agarose gel. Just think of it like a firm jello. Then you apply an electric current.
Right, and DNA is negatively charged, so it moves toward the positive end.
It wants to run toward the positive electrode.
Yeah.
But the gel is a mesh. It's a microscopic obstacle course.
So the small pieces can zip right through the holes in the mesh, but the big, long pieces get tangled up and move a lot slower.
Precisely. After a few hours, the DNA is perfectly sorted by size. Small stuff at the bottom, big stuff at the top. But you still have a problem. If you look at that gel under UV light, all you see is a smear.
Too many fragments.
Way too many. They're all overlapping. It just looks like a continuous streak of DNA. You can't pick out your specific marker from that mess.
Which brings us to the southern blot. And I noticed the notes here get into some specific chemistry that I think is often glossed over. It's not just taking a picture. There's a step called denaturation.
A critical step. Before we can find our target, we have to unzip the DNA. We soak the gel in an alkali solution, and this breaks the hydrogen bonds holding the double helix together. So instead of a double-stranded ladder, you have single strands.
And why do we need single strands?
Because of the probe. This is the magic trick. We transfer those single strands from the gel onto a nylon membrane. That's the blotting part. So now we have a permanent record of that smear on a sheet that looks kind of like paper.
Okay.
Then we wash that sheet with a fluid containing a radioactive probe.
And the probe is what exactly?
The probe is just a little snippet of DNA that we've made in the lab. And here's the key. It is the exact reverse complement of the gene or the marker we are looking for.
So it's the matching puzzle piece.
It's like magnetic Velcro. Because the DNA on that sheet is single-stranded, it is desperate to find a partner. The probe just floats around, ignoring billions of other fragments, until it bumps into that one specific sequence it matches. And click. It hybridizes. It sticks.
And because we made the probe radioactive?
We just slap a piece of X-ray film over that membrane.
Yeah.
Everywhere the probe stuck, it emits radiation and it darkens the film. When we develop it, the millions of other fragments are totally invisible. All we see are 1 or 2 dark bands.
That is just such a cool mix of biology and physics. You're literally using the DNA's own desire to pair up to find a needle in a haystack.
And that resulting image, those black bands on the film, that's the data. That is the RFLP readout.
Okay, so let's visualize the results from the case study in our notes. We've got 3 people. We're looking at one specific marker. We've cut their DNA, run the gel, blotted it, probed it. What do we see?
Okay, let's look at the film. Person A is homozygous dominant. So they have the cut site on both of their chromosomes, the one from mom and the one from dad. The enzyme worked perfectly. It cut the DNA into a fragment that is, let's say, 3,000 base pairs long.
So on the film, 1 band.
One single thick band right at the 3,000 mark.
Simple enough. Now, person B, they are homozygous recessive. They have the mutation on both chromosomes. The enzyme couldn't cut either of them.
Right. So because it didn't cut, that piece of DNA is longer. It includes that 3,000 base pair section, plus the neighbor it's still attached to. Let's just say the total is 4,500 base pairs.
So their film shows one band, but it's higher up?
One single band, but it's higher up the ladder at the 4,500 mark.
Okay, so just by glancing at the film, I can tell person A and person B are genetically different at that spot. But person C is the interesting one, the heterozygote.
The carrier. They have one copy of the chromosome with the cut site and one copy with the mutation. So when we process their DNA, well, half of it gets cut and half of it doesn't.
So they get both bands.
They get both bands, one at 3,000 and one at 4,500. This is actually codominance in action.
Right.
You can physically see both alleles present at the same time on the film.
This brings us to the so what question. We can see these bands. We can tell that I'm a heterozygote and you're a homozygote. But beyond catching criminals, which we touched on, how does this actually help us with something like medicine or food?
It all comes down to a concept called linkage. This is the idea that completely revolutionized clinical genetics.
Linkage, okay.
Imagine you're trying to find the gene for a really devastating condition, like Huntington's disease or cystic fibrosis. These genes are tiny, tiny errors in a 3 billion letter book. Finding them directly without a map is incredibly hard.
So you use the RFLK marker as a flagged stake in the ground.
Exactly. You look at a family tree, a pedigree, and you notice that everyone in the family who has the disease also happens to have that specific 4,500 base pair band we just talked about. And everyone who's healthy has the 3,000 band.
Okay, so that tells you the disease gene must be sitting right next to that marker on the chromosome.
It tells you they're neighbors. They're linked. And once you know the neighborhood, you don't have to search the whole world. You can just walk down the chromosome from your marker until you find the broken gene. This method was instrumental in isolating the genes for cystic fibrosis and Duchenne muscular dystrophy. We found the markers first.
And it's the same logic for agriculture, I'm guessing. You're not diagnosing a disease, but you're looking for, I don't know, good genes.
You could argue it's even more impactful there. Think about breeding wheat. You want a variety that's resistant to a specific fungal rust. Traditionally, you'd have to breed the wheat, grow it to maturity, infect it with a fungus, and then see if it dies.
Which takes a whole season.
A whole season. And if it dies, you've wasted months of time and resources.
Right.
With marker-assisted selection, you don't wait. You take a tiny snip of the leaf from a seedling that's 2 days old, you run the DNA. If it has the molecular marker linked to that resistance gene, you keep it. If it doesn't, you toss it. You can screen thousands of plants in a week without ever growing them up.
That is a massive efficiency jump. You're selecting for the trait before the trait even exists.
And it applies to everything. Drought tolerance in rice, flavor in tomatoes, muscle mass in cattle. We're breeding by design, reading the code rather than just guessing at the outcome.
There is a term in the notes that I think connects this back to the bigger picture of evolution. Monomorphic versus polymorphic. We've been focusing this whole time on polymorphism, the differences, but most of our DNA isn't like that, is it?
Not at all. And that is a really humbling realization. If I ran an RFLP on just a random gene, chances are you and I would look completely identical.
We'd have the same bands.
The exact same bands. We call that monomorphic. More than 99% of our DNA is the same. The enzymes cut in the same places because the sequence is preserved.
Because if it changes too much, the organism probably breaks.
Often, yes. Those conserved regions are the core machinery of life. But for mapping, for forensics, for evolutionary studies, we rely entirely on that tiny fraction of a % of variation. We need those polymorphic sites to tell the story.
So when we look at how those markers vary across populations, we can trace human migration out of Africa or figure out how closely related a wolf is to a chihuahua.
Exactly. It's our differences that let us build the map.
It's just wild to think that the pitchfork case started all this. We went from not even knowing how to tell people apart genetically to having a global database of millions of profiles.
It changed the legal landscape overnight.
Yeah.
Before these markers, forensic evidence was just blood type. Type A. Well, millions of people have type A blood. It's not specific at all. RFLP and the technologies that came after gave us a fingerprint that was unique to the individual.
But, and I think this is where we should probably land, it all comes back to that junk DNA.
The great irony of the genome.
Right. We spend all our time worrying about the genes, the coding regions that actually make proteins. But these markers, the RFLPs, the STRs, they're mostly living in the silent spaces between the genes.
They are. The very things that make us unique, the fingerprints we use to solve crimes or track our lineage, are often found in the regions that, biological dogma used to say didn't matter.
So our identity, in a way, is written in the margins.
I love that. The text of the book makes us human, but the scribbles in the margins make us individuals. And as we learn more, we're realizing those margins might be controlling the story a lot more than we ever thought.
It makes you wonder what else is hiding in there, just waiting for a new pair of scissors to come along and find it.
There's always another layer to the map.
Well, I'm definitely going to be thinking about molecular scissors next time I eat a tomato. Thanks for walking us through the toolbox.
My pleasure. It was fun.
And thank you for listening. Keep asking questions, and we'll see you